Halito, y'all. This is Chief Steve coming at y'all with another one. Hey, it's been a minute. Just wanted to throw something on here because I got a lot of talk about slavery, being descendants of slaves, and I just wanted to set the record straight. We were never slaves. We, as the Aborigine, the American Indians, were never slaves. And I mean, the record's been set straight multiple times. There's many different sources. But I'll just let this sister, this Powhatan sister, speak on who were actually the slaves in this country.
Origins of Africans that were documented as coming here to this country. We also had a very large percentage of indentured Europeans who came to Fairfax County. We all too often hear about those people who were enslaved under a heinous system of chattel bondage, but we seldom, if ever, hear about those people who came here as indentured people from Europe. And I'm mentioning that because there's a lot of emphasis placed on enslaved people, and we forget that probably most of the Europeans that came here were indentured. They weren't all the lords and ladies that arrived from England looking for better hunting or what they call the virgin land, my people call the oiled land. They wanted new experiences when they came to the Americas. Virgins.
So basically what this sister is saying is that there were slaves, but the majority of the Europeans that were out here were the slaves. They were the indentured ones. And yeah, you had some that came from Africa, but the number is so small and insignificant that it honestly doesn't give explanation or validation rather to the large mass amount of people, Aborigine people that we have here. And by Aborigine, I do mean the so-called black people, the dark copper-colored skin people. The majority of them were already here. Very few came from Africa. And honestly, it wasn't enough to really make it a big deal. So that's how you know the out of Africa theory is a theory in itself, because you even have accounts from the Colonial papers, which I made a video about it last time, and I'll throw it up here again, that the colonies were too broke to even sail to Africa. So those that were coming, that were supposedly from Africa, it was very, very few of them coming through there. It was very few in between. And at the same time, those who were prisoners of war during the Indian Wars from the 1600s on up, those who were captured and were transported were relabeled as Africans. That was a part of their prison sentence. And there's sources out there on that. If you want some on it, go ahead and drop a comment. I'll be sure to give y'all some sources. But for today, and pause for the cause and move over to this document that I found and just share a passage of what I just seen here. Let's pause for the cause. All right, Halito, y'all. We're back. This book is entitled The First Americans, 1607 through 1690. Here it speaks about those indentured European servants. And it speaks about the African slave trade. So without further ado, I'm going to get into it. We're going to start over here on page 23, second paragraph. All right, here we go. The greatest need of the tobacco colonies was for cheap labor. Tobacco requires not skilled hands, but many hands. With land to be had almost for the asking, the only impediment to the rapid accumulation of wealth was the difficulty in securing adequate help in the tobacco fields. Had the English, during the early years of the 17th century, shared in the African slave trade, there can be little doubt that Virginia and Maryland would have been from the first inundated with black workers and the entire region divided up into large estates. So they're saying in the 17th century, there were not enough Negro workers, Negro slaves. There were not enough black Africans. There were not enough black workers. But everybody wants to talk about 1619 Virginia. That's when they started coming. That's when well, look, this is from 1607 to 1690. And they're saying they did not have enough. So where did all these African slaves come from? Makes you question, huh? That's because the majority of the dark cup of colored people out here were not slaves. Neither were they Africans. You feel me? But let's keep going. But at this time, slaves in large numbers were not to be had. The Dutch, the Spaniards, and the Portuguese monopolized the trade, and woe to the English ship which ventured too near their stations on the Guinea coast. So they weren't even letting the English get out towards that way. And then a lot of them, like I said, were too broke to even go out there. You can check my videos, go in my library and find that video. I'll throw something up there as well at the end of this to back this up from the Colonial papers. But yeah, the Dutch and the Spaniards and the Portuguese, they weren't even letting the English come out through that way. It says, a few enterprising planters succeeded in stocking their estates with slaves, even before the middle of the century, and by so doing, laid the foundations of large fortunes. But for 100 years, from the 1600s basically to the 1700s, you feel me? For 100 years, the number of Negroes was insignificant when it came to their working, when it came to being slaves. Virginia and Maryland had to solve their labor problem in some other way. And mind you, around this time, they were kidnapping our people from our tribes, and they were putting them out there on their plantations and making them workers. But that in itself was a failed plan, because even now they say the number of Negroes was insignificant. And those that were captured during the wars and everything that were, labeled as Africans, it still wasn't enough for them to make a huge economic boost. Okay? But they did get slaves, though. They had to find slaves some other way. And this is what they did. Naturally, they turned their eyes to the unemployed of the mother country. Their mother country is England. It says at this time, England was overflowing with indigent persons who worked for meager wages, if indeed they could find work at all. In 1622, a distinguished minister declared that often the ablest London workers complained to him that though they and their families were away, their flesh with long and excessive labor. They could hardly keep breath in their bodies. So this was a lot of it was just too. This climate was just too harsh for them out here. The hot sun. They wasn't built for it. You see, it says in 1610, Rutland County fixed the annual wages of a plowman at 50 shillings, of an ordinary working man at 40 shillings, of a skilled woman worker at 26 shillings and 8 pence, of a male drudge at 16 shillings, and had the Virginia planters been able to secure labor at such prices, they would have flooded the world with tobacco and reaped a tremendous benefit. But it was no easy matter to transport thousands of laborers from the farms and towns of England to the planters on the James and the Potomac. The fare was from 6 to 10 pounds sterling, some so far above the means of the poor English laborer as to make the voyage impossible for him unless some scheme was devised to advance him credit. So this is basically, what are they doing now, man? What do you think they're doing with the immigrants and stuff now? And they're devising different ways for them to come out here so they can get cheap labor instead of paying the people what they needed to pay them. The same thing is happening now. You know what that means? That means that what you call a job is nothing but servitude. And when you have work contracts where you have to work for this place for a certain amount of time, we call those salaries, don't we? Don't we call those salaries? Where we get work contracts and we're guaranteed a certain amount of money over a certain amount of years, usually 1 year. It's usually 1 year now, but these used to be 5 to 7 years indentured servitude. Huh? That's what they're doing. That's what they've been doing. That's what they were doing back then. We were never slaves. And some of our people that did go out and work, we were indentured servants. But the majority of the people that was getting to work and stuff was English immigrants. And the majority of our people owned the land that they were at because they were the Aborigine. They still are. We still are the Aborigine. But there were no African slaves that were just boated from Africa to America. Not like that. Because as you can see, they were having a hard enough time getting their people from England to America, which was actually a closer voyage and a more reasonable voyage than going all the way to the freaking Africa. Yet, like I said, they were barely getting their people out there, unless they were devising some kind of scheme. They were finding some kind of way of smuggling people in on these boats and then getting them out here and working them cheap labor. So let's drop down a little bit further, though. We're gonna start right here. It says the planters. I'm starting right here, family, if you can't see. Okay, the planters and their agents agreed to pay the immigrants passage to America, and he in turn bound himself to make good the sum by working after reaching the colony. In this way, the indentured or indented servant, as he was called, not a slave, right, sold his labor in the better market. It would have required a lifetime for him to save enough from his wages in England to pay his fare, but in Virginia, the work of 4 or 5 years was sufficient. True, he had to surrender for this period the liberty so dear to every Englishman, which was his freedom. his right to ownership. But the compensations were great. When his service was completed, he found himself a free man in a new country where land was cheap. $5 to be exact. Wages was high and advancement was rapid. So that's how they got out here. That's how these so-called settlers got out here. That's how these foreigners got out here. They came out here as indentured servants. They were the slaves. They were the slaves that were coming out here. They were slaving literally for 5 to 7 years. They were slaves. And then once their work contract was up, they took their salary wages and they bought land. That's what they did. If it was a whole bunch of Africans, so-called black Africans coming out here during the slave trade, don't you think that we would have more Africans out here owning shit? Don't you think there would be more Africans in America owning land? But who do you say own the majority of land in the United States? The so-called European descendants. Why? Because their ancestors were slaves from England who came out here with an indentured. Now let's put a little kindness on there. They were indentured servants. Okay? But we gonna use their word though. They were indentured servants, what we know today as slaves, and they were only slaves or indentured servants from 5 to 7 years. After those 5 to 7 years was up, and literally that was the reason why they went into indentured servitude, was to get out here. That was their way of smuggling them. They would have them come in, get on the ship, say, okay, Mr. So-and-so, you can come on the boat, you can come to America, but you're going to owe this fare. This fare to get you out here was X amount of shillings or sterlings, right? Basically the equivalent to a good amount of dollars. Too much to where the wage in England couldn't even cover it. So they said, well, I'll go ahead and work out here. I'll be indentured for 5 to 7 years. You're going to work on this tobacco field on our plantations for 5 to 7 years. And once you get up your money, then you can be a free man. Once your time is up and your money is right, you're a free man. You can go buy some land and you can basically go do the same thing. Get you some slaves out here. The English were the slaves, not the Negroes, the so-called black people, not the Aborigines. The English people, the so-called white folks, was. And honestly, they all came in different shades but a lot of them passed as well. And they were able to, like I said, buy up Indian land. So that's that. I mean, like I said, this is let me get the First Americans. There you go. This is that book, The First Americans, 1607 through 1690. You can find this on Google Books. This digitized by Google. This is actual history, or should I say true story, documentation about slaves during the 17th century. And then we're going to pause for the cause one more time so I can give you the Colonial paper itself, stating that a lot of these colonies, different governments, were too broke to even go to Africa. Let's pause for the cause. All right, family, we're back. And here is that copy. This is the Colonial Papers. I do have the source and everything listed in the, I believe in my other video, the video that I had this in. I can't think of it right off the head. But this is the colonial. These are the colonial papers. Like I said, if you need sources, need a source to this, hit me in the comments. I'll be more than happy to drop them for you. All right. But let's read this. Started at the highlight version. I had to highlight this, man. And every time I get into it with anybody, rather it be, those who are native that want to cling us to Africa to validate our displacement, or those even of our kind, Aborigines that don't know that they're Aborigines, that are trying to cling to Africa to basically discredit us who are woken up, who have awakened. I hate to hear that. I hate saying woke or that's, that's a whole nother, that's a hijack in itself from the conscious movement. But like I said, yeah, let's not even get into all that. But those of us who have awakened and who are still up, okay, because woke is past tense, we still up, we been up. And now we got to a point where we're trying to educate our people and wake our other people up. There are some that discredit us and try to cling to the African theory. But this is from the colonial papers themselves. This is a governor that is writing to the crown, writing to England. And he says, as to the 109th article, there have been no Negroes imported into this government from the coast of Africa, either by the company or separate traders, since my arrival, nor like to be, while the price of tobacco is so low. And I just showed you how much they were paying these people, and that was pennies compared to, you know what I mean? What it would cost to make a voyage all the way to Africa. They were having to work off their voyages to England. It took them 5 to 7 years to work off their voyages from England to America. So you can only imagine how much the fare was from Africa to America and how long they would have to stay in servitude for that. But they couldn't even get away with doing that because they didn't even have enough to get boats out there to do that, much less try to pay people, because they had to be paid. And those who were indentured that did not get paid, there are letters and accounts of those people writing and complaining to their so-called masters, to their employers, but to their masters. Is written. That was the legal position title, masters, whoever owned the business. They were writing to their masters stating that they did not get paid. And when the masters tried to get them to work more, they would refuse to be paid. And a lot of them got labeled as runaways. We know as Seminoles, and a lot of them got, a lot of them were basically labeled as runaways. The Europeans, they were runaway slaves as well. Those, they had a master or somebody that wasn't treating them right, that had unfair labor, and they weren't getting paid right or getting paid what they were promised. They'd run away. And then that's when you had the development of the slave patrol. They weren't just hunting for black people. They were hunting for indentured servants who ran away from their work, from their fields. And sometimes they had the money, but they didn't put in the time, and they would still run off. And they had to get the slave patrol out there to catch them, round them back up, and bring them back. So that's how that worked. But I'm telling you right now, they did not have any slaves from Africa, off the coast of Africa, back then. And this was written back in the 1700s. So we went from something from the 17th century, from 1607 to 1690. And now these papers was written in 1711 and 1712. 1700s. And they still didn't have any people, any so-called Negroes from the coast of Africa. The only Negroes that was out here, family, was us, was the Aborigines. How can you explain all of us being here in the numbers that we are, if they didn't have no Africans, that only means one thing. We were already here. It went down further to say that they actually brought a few from Barbados, and yeah, their lords didn't even know about this. England didn't even know about them. So they were taking our people, like I said, because Barbados is a part of the West Indies. They are Aboriginals as well. They are indigenous Aborigines. They are Americans. Because this whole side of the map was considered the Americas. North, Central, and South, and all the surrounding islands was Americas. And they were smuggling people, our people, kidnapping our people, trading our people, hustling basically our people, and putting them into those unfair labors, Aborigines. And the crown halfway knew about it. They at least didn't know about it until the 1700s when somebody actually decided to write them. So, yeah, that's what was going down. So check out my other video on this. I ain't gonna spend too much time. I'm pretty much done now. But I just wanted to let y'all know we were never slaves. Not like that. And those who were, only they had to put in their time. Once they put in their time and they got their money up, those were your so-called freemen. Okay? All right, family. Y'all take care.